you ever felt that someone so powerful, so untouchable, could fall because of something unseen? That everything they've built, every dollar and every wall of pride, could crumble, not because of a person, but because of something beyond human comprehension. My name is David, and what I'm about to share with you was confessed to me by a man who had it all, and lost everything in the strangest way imaginable. And the worst part, he wasn't the only one. Richard Collins was the most feared name in the business world of Houston. A billionaire, owner of companies that handled millions of dollars, he lived above any rule, and he didn't care what it cost to stay at the top. He believed the world was at his feet, and if something broke, he could just buy another. His life moved to the rhythm of exclusive meetings, risky investments, and decisions that affected hundreds. His office was perched atop the Liberty Tower, with windows that let him gaze down at the city like some modern-day deity. For him, empathy was a useless luxury, and efficiency his creed. That Tuesday, as he ended a call where he fired one of his managers with a single word, his assistant Rachel entered with a reminder. "Mr. Collins, this afternoon you must go to Evergreen Memorial Cemetery to renew the ownership of your family's mausoleum. It's mandatory that you sign in person," she said cautiously, weighing every word. Richard grimaced as if he had tasted something bitter. "Can't they just send me the paperwork? Isn't there someone else who can handle it for me?" He growled, annoyed. "The cemetery rules require the owner's presence, sir. I tried, but it's an old regulation. Old and ridiculous," he snapped, straightening his tie. "How long is this going to take?" "No more than 20 minutes if all goes well." 20 minutes, he echoed as if it were years. "Fine, get the car ready. I want this done as fast as possible." Richard was already thinking about his next meeting, the millions at stake, and how that visit to the cemetery was just a ridiculous interruption in his day. If only he had known that those 20 minutes would change his life forever. If you love horror stories, subscribe and turn on the bell. This is just the beginning, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming. As the black car made its way to the outskirts of Houston, the sky began to darken. No one could have predicted that the moment Richard stepped onto that cemetery ground, he wouldn't just sign some papers, but his own fate. Richard's black SUV pulled up in front of the iron gates of Evergreen Memorial Cemetery. The tires screeched as they hit the damp gravel road, and for a moment the engine fell silent, as if the place itself absorbed all sound. Richard stepped out, adjusting his jacket with irritation. The air smelled different there, heavy with moisture, old flowers and something else, something he couldn't place, but that turned his stomach. As he walked, his freshly polished Italian shoes sank slightly into the soft earth. Each step felt like a small insult to his pride. Rachel had told him he needed to sign the documents in a small office near the entrance, but the place looked like a maze of tombstones and mausoleums stretching out like a stone forest. And then he saw him. Near a moss-covered mausoleum, a man knelt, his hands caked with dirt. He wore a sun-faded shirt and stained trousers. Beside him, a shovel rested, as if it were an extension of his body. This was Jacob, the cemetery's groundskeeper, and the moment Richard saw him, he scowled. Something about the man's calm demeanor irritated him instantly. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice louder than necessary. Jacob slowly lifted his gaze, his pale, almost translucent eyes meeting Richard's. There was no anger in his face, only a disarming serenity. "Where's the office? I need to sign some papers," Richard added, keeping his distance as if the dust of the place could dirty him. Jacob stood, wiping his hands on his pants. He was shorter than Richard, and his hunched back told of years of toil in that place. "The office is that way," he said, nodding toward a small stone hut, barely visible among the graves. "Perfect," Richard replied, turning to leave, but something made him pause. He looked Jacob over with disdain and muttered, "Can't they get someone more competent to look after this? The place is a mess. Look at my shoes." Jacob lowered his eyes to Richard's shoes, then raised them again, filled with an ancient sorrow. "The earth has its time, sir, and it deserves respect." Richard let out a dry, humorless laugh. Respect? This is just dirt and bones. Do your job properly and at least keep the path clean. Without waiting for an answer, he turned and walked away. He didn't see how Jacob watched him, or how a shadow briefly crossed the man's face, not of anger, but of pity for a lost soul. As Richard signed the documents, barely paying attention, something in the air seemed thicker, as if the cemetery itself had heard every word. On his way back to the car, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Jacob was still there, standing as if seeing him off, or waiting for him to return. And you, have you ever felt something following you, even when you think you've left it behind? Back at his office, high atop the Liberty Tower, Richard felt that the day had already gone badly enough. He checked his watch, a Swiss piece that always ticked with surgical precision. Everything needed to go back to normal. There were millions waiting for him, decisions that couldn't wait. But something imperceptible seemed to have shifted. That same afternoon, during a video call with investors in Madrid, the screen froze. The voices turned to static, then fell into absolute silence. He tried reconnecting, pressed buttons, cursed. Nothing. His assistant Rachel rushed in. "Mr. Collins, I checked the system. There's nothing wrong with the network. Everything's working perfectly." Richard slammed the laptop shut. A technical glitch, of course, it happens. But inside him, an unease began to grow. Minutes later, his watch stopped ticking. Richard felt the dead weight on his wrist. He shook it, tapped it gently. Nothing. The perfect mechanism halted for no reason. He took off the watch, threw it in the drawer, took a deep breath. He wasn't going to let minor things ruin his day, but it wasn't the last. While pouring coffee from his imported machine, the cup slipped from his hands. The dark liquid spilled over important documents, ruining them. He cursed, wiped furiously, but it was too late. Minor incidents, yes, but unusual. A dropped call, a stopped watch, spilled coffee. Nothing that couldn't be fixed. But why now? Why all together? Richard wasn't superstitious. He believed in control, in numbers, in logic. But that night, as he looked out over the lit-up city from his window, an image crossed his mind uninvited. Jacob's face covered in dirt, with those calm, clear eyes. He shook his head. No time for nonsense. Still, as he turned off the light, the silence in the office felt deeper than ever, as if something waited in the dark, something he couldn't yet see. Have you ever felt that what starts small can break everything? The following days were a parade of setbacks. What once seemed to be under Richard's absolute control began to unravel piece by piece, as if every cog in his empire had decided to stop turning. The deal with an energy company in Phoenix, which was all but finalized, suddenly fell apart for no apparent reason. The other party, once enthusiastic, now hesitated, delayed meetings, and raised ridiculous obstacles. "This isn't normal," Richard muttered, scrolling through emails on his phone. It can't be. But that was just the beginning. A report from his analysts revealed that a key investment, considered the safest of all, had started to plummet in value. Nothing in the market justified such a drop. He tried to reach his advisors, but their responses were vague, evasive. Tension mounted. His schedule filled with problems, and every attempt to fix them seemed to open new fronts in an endless war. And then, the noises began. At night, in his penthouse overlooking the Rocky Mountains, Richard started hearing footsteps. At first, he thought it was the usual sounds of the building, but these steps were different, slow, deliberate, as if someone were walking just outside his bedroom. When he got up to check, there was nothing. No doors ajar, no signs of intruders, just silence. A silence that didn't soothe him but pressed on his chest. And it wasn't just footsteps. The lights flickered one by one. His computer rebooted on its own. Items on his desk appeared out of place. The worst was one night when he found a footprint, a mark of fresh soil, right in the hallway. There was no logical explanation. No one had entered. Richard began losing sleep, and in the few hours he managed to rest, Jacob appeared. He didn't speak. He just stared from a distance with those pale eyes, as if he knew something Richard didn't. Fear, A feeling Richard had never known began to nest in his mind. And you? Have you ever felt something lurking, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? The auditorium at the Lincoln Convention Center was packed. White lights lit every corner of the stage, and at the center, as always, stood Richard Collins. Dressed in flawless black, he projected the image of an unshakable leader. This was his grand return, his chance to prove he was still the master of the game, that nothing could bring him down. Behind him, a giant screen displayed charts, blueprints, and millions in figures. He was presenting his latest project, a real estate complex promising to transform the industrial zone of Houston. The audience listened intently, mesmerized. Richard smiled. Finally, something was going right, but just as he was about to unveil the project's centerpiece, the image vanished. First, a distortion at the corners of the screen, then a flicker, and finally, total darkness. Richard turned, bewildered. "What's going on?" he whispered as the crowd murmured. A technician rushed over from the side, gesturing, trying to reboot the system. Richard swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "I apologize. It seems we're experiencing a technical issue. Just a moment." But the minutes dragged on. The silence grew heavy. Every second without a display was a crack in his perfect facade. Then his phone vibrated. He pulled it from his pocket, expecting anything but what he was about to hear. "Mr. Collins," Rachel's voice was taut. "There's been a leak, a fiscal report. They're saying there's evidence of fraud in your past projects." The world stopped. Richard felt the auditorium blur before him. He looked up and saw faces changing. Some were already reading on their phones. Others stared at him, as if seeing him for the first time. "No, that can't be," he murmured. But the words had no strength. He didn't know if it was the blackout, the news, or the combination of everything. But in that moment, he realized something else was at play. Something he couldn't grasp, but that struck where it hurt the most. His pride. He left the stage, ignoring the questions, the flashes, the growing buzz. Outside, the Houston sky seemed darker, as if night had fallen all at once. He got into his car but didn't start it. He just sat there, breathing heavily. In the rearview mirror, he thought he saw something, a figure in the distance on the sidewalk. He blinked. Nothing. But inside him, the certainty grew. This wasn't coincidence. These weren't technical glitches. Something had started, something he couldn't stop. What if what we ignore always finds a way to return? After that night, Richard was no longer the same. The news of the alleged fraud spread like wildfire. Headlines called him the fallen titan of Houston. His image, once the epitome of success, now adorned front pages with words like scandal, deceit, and betrayal. The banks, once eager to greet him with red carpets, now demanded explanations. His partners, who used to chase him for deals, no longer answered his calls. His inner circle vanished as if they'd never existed, and at home things grew even darker. The nights were torment. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. Now he heard whispers, indistinct phrases, as if someone spoke from behind the walls. The lights flickered more violently, objects fell without cause. Once he found his portrait, the one hanging by the entrance, shattered on the floor. No one had entered, but something or someone had. Richard tried to hold on to sanity. He hired technicians, changed the locks, checked every corner of his penthouse. Nothing. Everything remained the same, or worse. And then he remembered that day, that place, Jacob's words. The groundskeeper. "The earth has its time, sir, and it deserves respect." A phrase that had seemed absurd then, but now echoed in his mind like a cursed refrain. Could it be? He asked aloud, staring at his weary reflection in the mirror. But he didn't want to believe it. He couldn't. His world had always been built on logic, on results, not on superstition. Yet, with each passing day, something took more of him. His business, his health, his sleep, and something more, his soul. One early morning, while trying to work in silence, he heard a different sound, not steps, not whispers. It was like something being dragged down the hallway. He stood, heart pounding, and walked slowly. There on the carpet, a mark, as if someone had passed through, leaving a trail of wet earth. Richard fell to his knees. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. "What do you want from me?" he shouted to the air, to the silence, to whatever was there. But there was no answer. Only the cold, cutting sensation that he had crossed a line, and going back wouldn't be so easy. What if it's not about what you lose, but what you discover when you have nothing left? There was nothing left. Richard, the man who once ruled Houston from above, now wandered its streets like a stranger. No car, no bodyguards, no power. He had sold his penthouse, his company was in ruins, and debt was suffocating him. He slept in a small, rented apartment where silence was no longer a luxury, but a curse. Every night, the whispers continued. The shadows visited him, and always, Jacob appeared in his dreams. No longer as a distant figure, but as a constant reminder of what had begun. That's when he understood. It had all started there, in that cemetery, in that moment of disdain, of arrogance. "I have to go back," he whispered one morning, staring at the city from a bus stop. The journey to Evergreen Memorial Cemetery was long, not in distance, but in the weight he carried. Every step, every curious glance from strangers was an open wound. He was no longer the Richard everyone knew. Now he was just a broken man, seeking answers in a place he once despised. When he arrived, the air felt heavier, but not like before. It wasn't hostile. It was expectant, as if the place knew he was returning, not as a king, but as a penitent. He walked slowly, with respect. The headstones no longer seemed like cold stones, but silent witnesses to something greater, something he had never wanted to see. And then he saw him, Jacob, kneeling beside the same mausoleum, tended to a small patch of wildflowers. Time didn't seem to have touched him. Richard approached, his heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. "Jacob," he said, voice unsteady. I needed to see you." The groundskeeper looked up, unsurprised, as if he had known Richard would return. "I was a fool. I treated you poorly, you and this place. I thought I could control everything, that nothing could touch me. But I was wrong. Everything I've lived, everything I've lost, I feel like it all began here." The words came out on their own, heavy with guilt, raw and real. "I don't know if it matters, but I'm sorry, truly." Jacob studied him silently. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a deep, abiding calm. "The earth listens, Mr. Collins," he finally said, "and it forgives those who truly repent. Nothing more, no reproach, no promises, just those words, which fell like a balm into the heavy air. Richard felt something release inside him, as if an invisible rope that had been tightening for months had suddenly come undone. He didn't know if everything would change. He didn't know if the torment would end. But for the first time, he felt relief. "And you? What would you do if you knew that only forgiveness could stop what you've set in motion?" Returning from the cemetery wasn't a journey of instant redemption. There were no lights, no miracles. Richard didn't regain his fortune, and the headlines didn't clear his name. Real life carried on, with its weight, with its wreckage. But something had shifted. The nights remained silent, but the whispers had ceased. The shadows, once constant, no longer visited him so often. His dreams, though still murky, didn't leave him waking in sweat and fear. Jacob still appeared now and then, but his face was no longer stern. He merely watched, like an old guardian. Richard found work at a small consultancy, a place where no one knew him, where his last name didn't open doors. There, for the first time, he listened more than he spoke. He helped however he could, without imposing, without commanding. He lived in a modest apartment, in a quiet neighborhood. He took public transport. He walked streets he never would have walked before. And in those walks, he discovered faces, stories, details he had always ignored. He wasn't happy, not yet, but there was a calm, A sense that even if he couldn't change the past, he could live with it. The fiscal investigation, that storm that nearly destroyed him, began to fade. Some of the evidence turned out to be inconsistent, other parts not as severe as first reported. The media stopped speaking about him, found new targets, but Richard wasn't looking to return. He didn't want to rebuild his empire. He wanted to understand what had happened, and most of all, he wanted to respect it. Sometimes, walking through the city, he still felt the invisible gaze of something. Not a threat, not punishment, just a quiet presence, reminding him not to forget what he had learned. One morning, while waiting for the bus, he saw a boy help an elderly man carry some bags. Something so simple, but he watched with a strange, almost new emotion. Richard understood that he would never be the man he once was, and for the first time, that didn't bother him. Could it be that what we most fear losing isn't what we truly need to keep? He hadn't planned to return to Evergreen Memorial. There was no reason, no papers left to sign, no excuse to go. But that afternoon, passing nearby, something stopped him. Not a voice, not a sign, just a feeling. Like a silent call rising from the ground itself. He stopped at a flower stand on the corner. He didn't pick the showiest bouquet or the most expensive. He chose a small bunch of white daisies. Simple, but full of life. He paid, and without thinking too much, stepped through the cemetery gates. The air there felt different, lighter, or maybe it was just him who now sensed it differently. He walked slowly, recognizing the ground, every headstone, every tree, every corner, not with the impatience of before, but with a kind of reverence. He reached the same mausoleum, the one he once scorned, the place where he had first found Jacob. The groundskeeper wasn't there. Only silence kept him company, and the distant song of a bird he couldn't name. He knelt, not caring that his pants got dirty, and placed the flowers beside the little garden Jacob had tended so carefully. He touched them gently, as if afraid to break them. He said nothing. It wasn't necessary. He stayed there, breathing, letting time pass without urgency. For a moment, he felt he was being watched, not judged, not threatened. Just that ancient calm that seemed to wrap around the whole place. As he stood, a light breeze brushed his face. Not cold, not warm, just there like a whisper from the earth itself. He took a step back, looking at the place one last time, and it was then he heard something, or thought he did. A word, or maybe a thought. Remember, he didn't turn around. It wasn't fear, it was respect. He walked toward the exit with steady steps, feeling that even though his life would never be what it once was, something within him had begun to bloom. Something that wouldn't wither, like those white flowers now resting on the soil. Outside, the city continued on, people rushing, car horns, laughter, shouts. But inside him, a fragile peace, yes, but real, was growing. And you? What would you leave behind if you knew the past could bloom into something new? The Houston sun shone bright that morning. Richard, in a simple shirt and worn-out pants, walked through the city center. He was no longer the tycoon crossing avenues in armored SUVs. Now, he moved among people, just another face in the crowd, unhurried, unmasked. As he passed a small store, an elderly woman carrying several bags stumbled and dropped everything. Oranges rolled across the sidewalk, and for a moment no one moved. Richard knelt immediately without thinking. He gathered the fruit, smiled, and handed them to her. "Thank you, dear. So kind," she said, with a warm, sincere smile. Richard nodded, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. Before, he would have never stopped. Before, it wouldn't have even registered in his world. He walked to the bus stop and sat, watching life go on. He no longer had empires or million-dollar projects, but he no longer carried that crushing weight either, that emptiness he could never fill with money. Now, his wealth lay in those simple moments, in a greeting, a helping hand, a flower. Sometimes at night, he still dreamed, not of buildings or contracts. He dreamed of the cemetery, of the earth, of Jacob, but they were no longer nightmares. They were memories, teachings, like something reminding him to stay on this new path. The legal troubles didn't vanish overnight. Some things took time, others simply faded away. But that no longer consumed him. He had learned to live with the scars, to understand that not everything can be controlled, not everything can be bought. One evening, while watching the sunset from his window, he was surprised to find himself smiling. A quiet smile, free of arrogance, with nothing to prove. And for a moment, he felt the breeze drifting through the window carried a familiar scent. Damp soil, wildflowers. He closed his eyes and let it surround him. Because some falls don't destroy us. They simply show us where we must begin to plant again.